After years trapped in the soul-sucking confines of gray cubicles and under the cold, fluorescent glow of office lights, my heart longed for the raw embrace of nature. My evenings were spent scouring the net for an escape, a salve for my urban exhaustion. That's when I stumbled upon an odd job listing, a fire lookout. The pay was laughably meager, the hours were a testament to human endurance, and the fringe benefits, practically non-existent. But it promised an experience, an immersion into the wild I so deeply craved. What I thought would be a short sabbatical turned into nearly 10 years, each day more peculiar than the last. Most folks would nod off if I recounted the regular tales of my job, but there are certain tales that are not only unusual, but also downright bone-chilling. My position wasn't that of a regular firewatch. Was it just the quirk of my particular post? Or were others in my line also seeing things they couldn't quite fathom? I wasn't sure, but there were nights when our responsibilities stretched beyond simply watching for wildfires. On the inaugural day of my duty, I was escorted by a ranger, a man who seemed as weathered and sturdy as the woods he tended. Curiously, my training wasn't handed down from another lookout. Word was, the previous two had made hasty exits, leaving behind only a shroud of rumors about why. We trekked to the tower, a journey that felt both aimless and purposeful. Every time I thought we'd reached our destination, we'd veer off into a new direction. Yet when darkness began to cloak the woods, we arrived. Before the tower's clock struck 9:30 p.m., I was sternly advised to ensure the door was locked. There was a peculiar rule. This door should remain locked from dusk till dawn, without exception. And before sealing us in, the ranger, now my partner, quickly stepped out. When he returned, I noticed the splash of fresh red paint on his clothes, a stark contrast to the green of his ranger uniform. Once inside, I half expected a briefing, or at least some guidance on my duties. Instead, my partner seemed intent on ignoring me, settling into a couch as though preparing for a long nap. With nothing else to do, I explored our quarters. The tower, standing like a sentinel over the woods, was furnished modestly. A rudimentary kitchen, a Spartan bathroom, a lounge furnished with raw wooden pieces, and a storage room that looked more like an alchemist's closet, filled with objects whose purpose I couldn't fathom. The most striking feature, however, was the glass that surrounded each room, leading to balconies that offered an unobstructed view of the sprawling woods below. Attempts at striking up a conversation were met with monosyllabic answers. A couple of hours into the night, my partner broke his reticence, handing me a pair of binoculars that seemed straight out of a sci-fi movie. Activating them unveiled the world in remarkable clarity, darkness notwithstanding. It must have had infrared or maybe some sort of night vision, but it allowed me to monitor vast swaths of the forest. As the night wore on, a strange itch nagged at the back of my neck. Turning my attention to the immediate vicinity of the tower, my heart stopped. Hidden amidst the trees was an eerie silhouette, its movement rhythmic and consistent. Refocusing, the figure became clearer. It was a person, or at least seemed like one, moving in an exaggerated waving gesture, as if beckoning or maybe warning. I felt a cold shiver. The forest, it seemed, was alive with more than just trees. The figure's unwavering arm gesture became the bane of my night. While most would have dismissed it after a few moments, my gaze kept returning to it. Hours seemed to tick by, and every time I peeked out, the figure remained, a steadfast silhouette under the moonlight, ever waving in my direction. I sought solace from my partner, expecting some reasoning or reassurance, but all he offered was a gruff admonition to ignore it. That night laid the foundation for many bizarre shifts to come. The kitchen within our perch was a stark affair, bearing the same wooden aesthetics that permeated the tower's structure. Food choices were sparse, almost hilariously so. The only attempts at a meal were a lettuce sandwich or a salad, which was essentially the same sandwich minus the bread. The paltry selection was made even more dismal with a stash of unbranded ketchup packets, the only semblance of flavor in this culinary wasteland. Beverage options were even more uninspiring, bottled water and that was it. As for snacks, lightly salted crackers stood as the sole bastion of hospitality. For the initial weeks I played the role of the courteous guest, gagging down their offerings with a polite smile. But soon the allure of a hearty meal overcame my reluctance, So one day, I smuggled in my own packed dinner. That evening commenced in its usual manner, my partner stepping out, then returning, his attire splattered with traces of red paint. I settled in, ready to enjoy my own culinary delight when the true oddities of the evening began. Scanning the perimeter revealed not one, but several figures, all waving fervently. Their proximity was startlingly close, and through the binoculars I could discern the gleaming whites of their wide, unsettling smiles. But before I could fully process this unsettling gathering, a sudden commotion inside the tower snapped me back to reality. My partner, having caught a whiff of my clandestine meal, had commandeered it. In a fit of what I assumed was hunger-driven madness, he dashed out onto the balcony and unceremoniously discarded my food into the abyss below. He returned, his fury palpable, chastising me for my perceived transgression. According to him, outside food was strictly prohibited. I protested, genuinely unaware of such a rule. His demeanor shifted rapidly, from skepticism to introspection, and finally to a quiet resignation. While he accepted my ignorance, he declared that I was barred from stepping outside for the remainder of the night and proceeded to lock every balcony door. At first I believed it to be a cruel punishment, stripping me of the privilege to bask in the serene nocturnal beauty. But as night deepened, I discerned the actual reason. From below came a series of thuds, soft, rhythmic, but undeniably powerful. They resonated with such force that even our elevated vantage couldn't muffle them. Resorting to the binoculars once again, I tried to discern the source, but the angles and shadows proved obstructive. By dawn, the mysterious sounds had ceased. When we finally dared venture outside, the only remnants of the night's chaos were the scattered crumbs and wrappers from my ill-fated dinner. Whatever had been there, its presence had been commanding, and its reasons remained hauntingly elusive. The divots in the ground resembled the aftermath of a meteor shower, random craters scattered haphazardly. Though I was tempted to get lost in speculative thought about their origin, I was handed the additional task of smoothing the dirt and filling the depressions, leaving the ground as undisturbed as it once was. Despite being in a remote location, a rarity in itself, I encountered an unexpected sight on my approach to the tower one day. A group of young hikers, 4 of them, clad in camping gear, seemed set to brave the unpredictable wilderness for a night under the stars. While my training hadn't equipped me to address such encounters, my conscience prodded me to caution them of the dangers lurking in the woods, especially given the recent oddities I'd experienced. I approached them, keeping my warnings as vague as possible while attempting to underscore the importance of safety. Initially, they appeared receptive, but their doubt became evident when they inquired about my official capacity in the area. Admitting that I wasn't a ranger seemed to diminish my credibility in their eyes. As they moved on, offering only perfunctory assurances of their safety, I felt a sense of foreboding. Back at the tower, I observed the ranger's usual, unexplained ritual of returning with paint-smeared attire. Our typical routine resumed, but my mind was preoccupied with the hikers. After some contemplation, I shared my encounter with the ranger. He paused, seeming to retreat into deep thought. When he finally responded, it was with a query about the number of hikers. Remembering clearly, I confirmed that there were 5 of them. However, the night proceeded without further mention of them, and I engrossed myself in spotting nocturnal creatures. At daybreak, instead of our usual farewell, the ranger beckoned me to accompany him. We headed to the common entrance of the tree line, close to the popular parking spot. Once there, his grip on my shoulder tightened, and his other hand shielded his eyes, as if preparing for some anticipated event or ritual. His instructions were clear: inform him immediately upon seeing the hikers. Hours passed in tense silence, and just when hope waned, they emerged from the forest. Their demeanor was light, even jubilant. Reporting their appearance to the ranger, I mentioned again there were 5 of them, only to have him correct me, stating I had previously said there were 4. The discrepancies in our recollections were puzzling, but what followed deepened the mystery. The ranger instructed me to note down the license plate of the hiker's vehicle, relaying it over his radio as a code 369. His recounting of our conversation from the night before firmly asserted I'd said there were only 4 hikers. As I wrestled with my memory, Trying to reconcile the discrepancy, the ranger began a new tale, one that he said would shed light on everything. He began, "Let's discuss Mike." But Mike, it turned out, wasn't the ranger's name, and in time, I'd come to understand why I was better off never knowing it. As the days turned to weeks, my proficiency in the job's routines grew remarkably. But let's be honest, with the minimal tasks assigned to me, it wasn't exactly a difficult feat. The ranger and I had formed an unspoken routine. He would diligently apply his mysterious red paint, and I would organize my own schedule. To make the hours fly by, I interspersed my duty of watching the tree line with short breaks. These pauses became intervals of solace, where I could lose myself in reading, swiping through dating apps on my phone, or daydreaming of the world beyond the tower. One particular evening, my focus was intensely fixed on a faint movement in the brushes. I entertained the idea that it might be a deer or some other local wildlife. My concentration was so intense that when a soft voice greeted me from below, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Refocusing, I glimpsed a figure, dimly illuminated by the tower's glow. The man's voice was warm, undeniably inviting, and spoke with a tone that suggested an eternal grin stretched across his face. We engaged in light banter, and I discovered he was a frequent wanderer of these trails. He painted pictures of idyllic scenic spots and hinted that he might introduce me to these hidden gems. The only hitch? He had seemingly lost his way and wanted me to guide him back to his car. Initially, I was on board, but as I made my way to the door, my steps began to falter. Memories of the ranger's stern warning to never open the door played on repeat in my mind. My body seemed to be in a tug of war, with one part eager to help the lost hiker, and the other fearing the unknown consequences of disobeying instructions. As I stood in my internal conflict, the ranger, having noticed my distress, approached me with a quizzical look. I poured out the story, expecting advice or direction. However, his reaction was nothing I could have anticipated. In a flurry of emotion, the ranger collected various items from the table and began hurling them off the balcony, shouting a mix of expletives and firm admonitions for the man below to depart. His outburst left me stunned, rooted to the spot. Yet as abruptly as the episode had begun, it ended. The ranger retreated, reclaiming his previous spot, and resumed his reading as if the incident had never occurred. But let's shift gears a bit. I realize I haven't told you about the dancers. During my solitary stints, I looked for ways to make the long hours enjoyable. Reading, unfortunately, had never resonated with me. So, on a trip to town, I stumbled upon a gem at a thrift store, a vintage MP3 player. Its price was laughably cheap, and the shopkeeper seemed taken aback by my enthusiasm. Toning down the volume, I strained my eyes and ears for a better sense of the situation. For a brief moment, silence prevailed. Trusting my instincts, I resumed my duties, hoping the night would unfold without any other disturbances. But alas, hope has a cruel way of playing tricks on the vigilant. Every now and then, I'd spot a shadowy figure, or hear a faint whisper of movement. Each observation was fleeting, each sound ephemeral. Yet these disruptions took a toll on my peace, and more annoyingly, on the temperamental MP3 player, causing the music to skip with the slightest jolt. One time, driven by exasperation, I dashed to the balcony without pausing the music. What I witnessed was a sight straight from the darkest of nightmares. The forest's edge was lined with peculiar skeletal beings. Their rapid, disjointed movements seemed to mimic a twisted dance. Each entity was unique in its grotesque rhythm, but what united them was the pace of their movements. It was a rhythm I recognized, the exact tempo of the song still playing in the background. Realization dawned upon me. With trembling hands, I shut off the music. As the last note faded, I observed the creatures retreat, their dance slowing, eventually merging back into the shadows of the trees. From that night on, my player remained untouched. However, a few days later, when I returned to my shift after an absence, the shattered remnants of my player greeted me. The unceremonious display wasn't just an act of destruction, it was a clear message. Silence is golden. On a subsequent shift, with music no longer an option, I tried my hand at reading. The lighting in the station wasn't ideal for it, consisting of a few dim lamps and a pendulum bulb. This setting made any change in luminosity apparent. So, when the entire room was plunged into an unnatural darkness, I knew something was amiss. Glancing over, I noticed the ranger, his face a mask of tension, staring intently outside. The lack of light was so profound, even the night sky was devoid of stars. Without a word, the ranger went around, switching off every light source. The weight of the darkness was palpable. We sat there, in stifling silence, waiting. After what seemed like an eternity, the ambient light started filtering back in, lifting the heavy atmosphere. The rest of the night proceeded without incident. It was only later that I learned the grim importance of adhering to the unspoken rules of the watchtower. Among the regulars I observed from my perch were a woman and her child, who often wandered the vicinity. In our brief interactions, she revealed the story of her life. A widow trying to reconnect with her son after the loss of her husband. Every stroll they took was a step towards healing and rebuilding the bond that grief had strained. It was touching, and yet I couldn't help but worry for them, given what I had witnessed from the tower. The forest held secrets, and not all of them were benign. Lisa, with her warm spirit, and her son Joe, became one of the few constant figures in the unpredictable surroundings of my zone. Our interactions, though brief, always bore the semblance of a world outside the eerie confines of the forest. They were brief pockets of normalcy in an otherwise surreal reality. Over time, I divulged my name, a decision I'd later regret, especially considering that the ranger had always kept his name hidden. For the sake of narrative simplicity, let's refer to him as Brian. One particularly silent night was interrupted by a voice that had become all too familiar. Mike. My heart raced, and every bone in my body told me to ignore him. Yet, his claim of having fallen in love intrigued me, for it wasn't like his usual ploys to lure me out of my station. With a mix of trepidation and curiosity, I approached the balcony. To my horror, I found him with Lisa and Joe, their smiles painfully wide and unnatural, in stark contrast to Mike's gleeful expression. "They're excited to meet you," Mike proclaimed proudly. Lisa's voice, laden with sorrow and despair, echoed Mike's invitation, inviting me to a ceremony. Every fiber of my being ached to help them, but the voice of caution, born out of numerous chilling encounters, restrained me. It was evident to me that they had lingered past daybreak and had unfortunately crossed paths with Mike. And now, on my solitary shifts, their voices, laced with the power of my name, beckoned to me, making the urge to venture out almost irresistible. The haunting fear of succumbing to this call and becoming part of Mike's family plagues me. Another unwritten code in our handbook was to familiarize ourselves with the watchtower's layout. It was during one such evening, when the ranger and I shared a quiet shift, that I found myself brewing tea to get through the night. On reaching out for the tea bag, my hand brushed against an old Victorian-styled doll. It bore the grace of a bygone era, a face of ivory porcelain with delicate cracks, cherubic rosy cheeks, and piercing blue eyes. I've never particularly found dolls unsettling, but the silence that ensued felt thick with tension. As I admired the doll, a sudden pain shot up my leg, forcing me to the ground. Turning, I saw Brian, gun in hand, aiming not at a threat outside, but at my leg. Never before had I seen Brian this disturbed. This was the man who'd remained unfazed as we watched unspeakable horrors unfold in the woods. But this doll, this seemingly innocuous object, seemed to trigger something in him. The ensuing moments were a blur of pain and confusion, and as I tried to grasp the gravity of the situation, memories of past horrors played in my mind. The boundaries between reality and the supernatural became increasingly blurry, and I knew that survival demanded vigilance more than ever. Brian had always been an enigma to me. He had shown indifference to the direst of situations, maintaining a placid demeanor throughout. He had once had to make a harrowing decision between two look-alike hikers, one to kill and the other to spare. He read books spanning various genres, never displaying an inkling of emotion, not a hint of humor from a comedy, nor an eyebrow raise from a thrilling mystery. However, when I looked at him after the shot, his face painted a tale of grimness I had never witnessed. The pain was sharp and profound, and as my initial shock ebbed, I couldn't help but scream out. Brian, with urgency, tried to stem the bleeding and settled me on a couch. A quick check revealed that the bullet had merely grazed me. Whether that was a product of luck or Brian's intention was something I might never know. The remainder of the night forced me to rely on an old-fashioned crutch. When I limped back to the kitchen, the antique doll had vanished. Brian's cryptic remark, "One touch is all it takes," left a lingering sense of dread. That night felt like an intense chess match, with the doll as our elusive opponent. Brian resumed reading, though every so often he'd scan the room with unprecedented caution. As the hours wore on, my tea dwindled, and just as I was about to reach for another sip, Brian's book flew down, and his pistol was aimed at me again. My heart raced, but it soon became clear. He wasn't aiming at me. The doll had repositioned itself perilously close to my tea. The night unfurled with more eerie encounters with the doll. At one point, Brian left for the restroom and I heard a sharp shout. Hampered by my leg, I was helpless to offer immediate assistance, but I could only guess that the doll had again staged a menacing surprise. By dawn, Brian's pronounced sigh and subsequent supportive gesture to escort me to the hospital seemed to solidify our bond. I sensed that after surviving the ordeal of the night, he viewed me differently than previous recruits. Our role as Firewatch lookouts was primarily to detect potential fire hazards. On one such day, with Brian and me indulging in our peculiar shared reading habit, a change in ambient light caught my attention. A soft orange glow began to emerge from the tree line. Brian seemed indifferent, merely giving it a cursory glance before returning to his book. I attempted to mimic his nonchalance, but the glow intensified, revealing itself unmistakably as a fire, its hungry flames consuming everything and its smoke darkening the horizon. While I grappled with rising panic, a desperate voice pierced the atmosphere. "Help! Fire! Please help! My family are in there!" I rushed to the lookout edge and was met with a sight I never expected. It was Mike, devoid of his usual malicious smirk, genuine panic etched across his face. Mike's voice echoed with palpable panic. Skeptical, I retorted, "How can I be certain you aren't fabricating this?" Mike's frantic pointer towards the tree line showcased a sight I wasn't prepared for. All of the forest's phantoms, from the dancers, the wanderers, the minifigure man, and even the notorious doll, fleeing away from something. This mass exodus of supernatural beings was a clear indication that something extremely unsettling was taking place, sending jolts of fear down my spine. Desperate to get Brian to acknowledge the looming crisis, I shook him with all my might, only to find him deeply engrossed in his book, seemingly undeterred. From below, a resigned voice confirmed my fears. The fire was closing in on us. A stifling atmosphere started to envelop the lookout, with either flames threatening to consume us or smoke about to suffocate us. My survival instincts kicked in as I made a dash for the door, but Brian, unwavering in his reading stance, leveled his derringer at me. Heedful of the implicit warning, I returned to my seat, drenched in a cocktail of fear, frustration, and resignation. Time felt suspended as I sat there, the encroaching flames reflected in my wide eyes. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension, occasionally pierced by Brian's scrutinous glances to ensure I wasn't planning a rogue escape. But then, in what felt like an eternity, dawn's first light began to overpower the fiery glow. With the sunrise, the once menacing environment settled to its usual serene self. As our shift concluded, Brian and I made our way out, and to my astonishment, there were no traces of the preceding night's chaos. The absence of ash, the fresh air devoid of smoky residue, and the untouched wood made me question the reality of the previous night's horrors. It became clear that the woods had conjured yet another illusion, trying to draw us out, a test that Brian and I had just barely passed. Such anomalies weren't isolated. The unpredictability and the lack of patterns meant each night brought its own share of surprises. On one solo shift, immersed in my newfound love for reading, I found the surroundings plunging into the same enveloping darkness we had experienced a few months prior. Instinctively, I extinguished all light sources, even ensuring my phone was off. Left in the profound blackness, I was overcome by an eerie stillness. The vast, empty sky seemed to suffocate the landscape, devoid of the faintest light from the distant civilization. That's why, when a tiny light flickered in the tree line, It caught my immediate attention. A camper, presumably lost, was fumbling around trying to make a fire. But before they could get very far, a blinding, ethereal light from the sky focused intently on them. On a closer look, this radiant beam originated from a massive, shimmering eye fixated on the camper. As I cautiously observed, the surrounding stars began to disappear, only to realize they were being obscured by some colossal umbrella-like entity. Within moments, the camper was absorbed by the eye, which seemed to also serve as a gaping mouth. The creature, having satisfied its hunger, receded, floating away gracefully, much like a jellyfish in deep water. It took me a while to gather my wits and resume my reading, trying to process the unearthly encounter. The fire lookout job, which once seemed mundane, was turning into a nightly expedition into the unknown. From the deer without mouths, the inexplicable kidney repairman, to countless other bizarre sightings, each night was a lesson in unpredictability and survival. While I initially believed many quit due to the job's mundane nature, it was clear they were either overwhelmed or became victims of the forest's enigmatic inhabitants. For now, however, I had stories to share, hoping that others might find solace in the more ordinary nature of their jobs. After all, in a world where the supernatural and unexpected intertwine, one's tales might just serve as a lighthouse for another lost soul.